Well, it was in my childhood days, all autumn minutes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, ladies. It's my echo. If I haven't had the good fortune to meet you, my name is Kate Alexander. I'm Associate Director of Florida Studio Theater and Director of the play Thurgood and the Outreach Programs. Today is our first panel discussion, and I'm so happy to see so many people coming out for it. Thank you so much. Just to give you, before we bring the panelists out, I'd like to give you just a little bit of an overview. Thurgood is playing to about 16,000 people, to ovations every night, and our community has joined forces. Over 55 organizations are presenting companion component programs on diversity, racism, tolerance, whatever their venue is, from Ringling College to New College to the Sarasota Ministerial Association, declaring the month of February speaking racism from the pulpits, to our guest, Gilbert King, Pulitzer Prize winning playwright, author of Devil in the Grove. So we have a lot going on, and this is the first of 4 panel discussions. We hope you'll attend more. I'd like to bring out my panelists, and then I will introduce them. So without further ado, and if you would take a moment to turn off your cell phones, it would be appreciated. I'd like to bring out the panelists. Thank you. Actually, if you could be on that far chair, that'd be great. Immediately to my left is Laurence Eger, and if you don't know him, he's our public defender of the 12th District Court. That's 3 counties, and he is president of the Legal Aid of Manasota County as well. In the center is Dr. Lisa Merritt, a force of nature in Sarasota, who has the Multicultural Institute, and she's an author, lecturer all over. We welcome you, Lisa. Dr. Lisa. And Michael Farmer is with Equality Florida, and you are a field director. A field director with Equality Florida, and thank you so much for being here, Michael. Last but not least, the theater's good friend, Judge Charles E. Williams of the 12th District Court, who has been instrumental not only on the panels, but on guiding our outreach into the schools. He is personally going into classrooms where 1,500 students are coming to the theater to see Thurgood, as well as with METV have developed a film to go into the classrooms. Finally, I would like to thank METV Television not only for being here tonight, but creating the films for the classrooms and working together with us. Thank you. I'd like to turn it over to our guest moderator, Judge Charles E. Williams.
Thank you. I want to start this discussion with a premise. Whenever we discuss Thurgood Marshall, much attention goes towards his work for African Americans, and that specific fight for equality which culminated in the landmark decision of Brown versus Board of Education. However, Brown was a genesis for numerous changes in the laws of America, laws that affected all of our citizens. Laws banning restrictive covenants, peaceful demonstrations, coerced confessions, discrimination based on religion, faith, national origin also resulted from the principles laid down from the Brown decision. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. We have Title IX. We have the Americans with Disability Act. And all of these acts and legislations and laws, you can draw a line straight from Brown versus Board of Education. So the question I pose to the panel is, are we done? Have the laws protected us? We have legislation. Everyone appears to be covered at first glance by these laws and acts. So has the civil rights movement left anyone behind? And we'll start with Michael.
Well, I think for the LGBT community, we are particularly proud to stand on the great work that's been done, like people for Thurgood Marshall, the women's movement and the civil rights movement, and a lot of gay and lesbian people and transgender people see a lot of disparities that they think need to be rectified. Gay and lesbian people are still discriminated against in marriage. They're still able to be fired in the majority of counties in Florida. Thankfully, in the city of Sarasota, you can't be fired just for being gay or lesbian, but if you are in parish, you can. So we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to closing some of the disparities that are related to the gay and lesbian community, and I'm just glad to be here, so thank you.
Yeah, we have made a lot of progress, but we still have a ways to go. And I think when you talk about culture, which is my thing, there's one thing to make a law, and there's another thing for a society to truly adopt it and inculcate it in its behavior on an individual as well as a system level. Our particular area of concern is the whole issue of health inequities. We've made great progress in terms of the war on poverty, which a lot of this was also built on. But we still have a ways to go in terms of health care and the great number of health disparities that exist amongst different racial and ethnic groups. We had the Institute of Medicine report just within the last 10 years that showed that we still have a different way in which the outcomes and which people are treated based solely on race and ethnicity, not on socioeconomic status, education, or even their ability to pay for the care. And so I've been working with a group called the Health Equities Research Institute, and we're trying to look at that whole issue. How do we change the culture so that we can gain greater parity in terms of health care? Because without good health care and good access to health care, which we're also working on, that's still going to be a problem because people can't really realize all of their rights. If they're not feeling well, they can't be as productive as they should be.
They keep the microphone away from me so I can't speak. Because I'm the plucky comic relief of the group. There is no finish line. I can't ever say that we're ever going to reach that because with every era there's going to be a group or a segment of society that's going to be oppressed. We have a set of laws, and it is the enforcement of those laws and how we interpret them. It has evolved and will continue to evolve. It's always nice to say we've made this progress, but progress is inevitable. But so will the change necessary to bring about the equality that we're seeking. Right now, if you want to, as far as the projects that I've been personally working on, I'm looking at the homeless and I'm looking at the mentally ill. And you don't think of that as an identified group that has been subjugated in some way and they don't exercise the same rights and privileges. But clearly, they don't have the same rights. And you need only look at our prisons to see we have criminalized mental illness. And so their civil rights, as I see it, have been severely trampled upon. So it's going to be, it's an endless battle, as it should be. And we have a tremendous foundation. And the fact that we have a dialogue, which to me is the most important thing, we can continue to flush out where those inequalities exist and hopefully right those wrongs. But I guarantee you tomorrow we'll find other injustices, and those too will have to be addressed.
Michael, I'd like to ask you a question. Do you have any stats in Florida? You said somebody who's gay or lesbian cannot be fired in Sarasota. Can you give us a picture of the civil rights in Florida right now? And I'm going to ask the same for each of you.
Right now in Florida, there are no laws that protect the LGBT community from discrimination in employment, housing, or public accommodations. The state of Florida has a civil rights statute which protects you in all those areas based on your race, based on your ethnicity, based on your gender, but not on your sexual orientation or your gender identity. There are a number of counties that actually include 50% of the population in Florida that have gone and created those protections at the local level, but lots of counties have not. So particularly in employment, there's a lot of work to do in terms of passing a statewide law that adds the gay, lesbian, and transgender community to that civil rights statute. And of course, the county of Sarasota recently passed a domestic partner registry, which gives gay and lesbian and unmarried couples 7 rights that are really critical, including hospital visitation and a number of other things. But we still have an amendment in our Florida Constitution which allows for discrimination in marriage against the gay and lesbian community. And so that's certainly an area that needs to be changed.
Just to follow up on that, so a marriage can't happen in certain places in Florida, you're saying?
Nowhere in Florida.
Nowhere in Florida.
Right. And if you're married in another state like New York, where marriage is legalized for gay and lesbian couples, it would not be recognized in Florida.
How would that affect them on a daily level? Could you give us a picture of that?
It makes adopting children a lot more difficult. So if you're the biological parent of one child and you're not married, your spouse would have to adopt that child. If you were married, that wouldn't be an issue. So, and certainly with property inheritance, if your partner passes away, if you don't have the benefit of having the financial means to put together the documentation that will be required to make sure that all of your property that you've accumulated over your life transfers to your partner, would all go to the state. So,
Lisa, can you give us a picture of things that you're working with, or an example?
Well, to speak about disparities, health disparities, well, in a lot of different domains, if we just talk about health leadership, for example, that we still have a paucity of people of color in positions of leadership in the health industry, in the health educational arena, in the health education pipeline. For the last year we have statistics. I think we had 30 African American medical students graduate in the entire state of Florida, which is pretty unbelievable. And yet we have a fairly diverse population, particularly in our urban areas. When you look at the issue of HIV and AIDS, many people don't realize that Sarasota is one of the top 20 counties in the state of Florida for HIV and AIDS, and that although our local African American population is only 5%, they represent 30% of the cases of HIV in our own county. And there's a huge disparity statewide and nationally in terms of HIV and AIDS, where almost half the cases are in the African American population. And they're only 14% of the total population. When you look at infant mortality, when I first came here, and I was so fortunate to work with Dr. Hill, Washington Hill, and the infant mortality rate, nationally, the infant mortality rate for Caucasian babies is 6 per thousand. For African Americans, it's 14 per thousand. Locally, here in our general area, it was as high as 30, which is like a Central African country or something. We have done some great projects and partnerships, and we now have that down more with parity with the national, which is still more than twice. When you look at other conditions, stroke rate locally is twice that of the majority population. Diabetes, cancer, I could go on. And so that's part of why our effort is to work on focusing education and focusing prevention efforts on the populations at greatest risk. I think when you talk about the difficulty with couples and care, whether it's LGBT couple, whether it's an ethnic couple, whether it's somebody who doesn't speak the language, these are all situations where there's difficulties with access to care. And often that is not only due to the structural difficulty of finding your way through the system, but also the cultural incompetence that's there amongst the providers and the care systems. And so we have to do a better job of getting people more attuned to providing individualized care and really taking each case for what it is, and then understanding the genetic and cultural and religious and spiritual and whatever other things may impact that. And we need to do a better job of that. And as a female, as the representative female in the group, I can't, nobody's asked me that question, but can I go there?
I'm representative.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Kate. I was talking about our little panel, our little panel. Of course, you're every woman. So, we're fortunate here. We have 2 female CEOs of the hospitals. Fantastic. We just have our 2nd female chief of staff in 62 years at Sarasota Memorial, which we're very excited about. But when I take my kids up to tour the hospital and all of that, and they look at the wall and all the pictures, and some of our young females who are aspiring to health careers, it's a little disconcerting for them to see a lot of guys up there. We still have a ways to go in terms of leadership positions. And I think that's one of the areas that we could do better.
Thank you. Larry?
I guess I come here tonight wearing 2 hats. I am the elected public defender for the 12th Judicial Circuit, and in my role as public defender, I represent poor people who have been accused of a criminal charge. I also am the president of Legal Aid of Minnesota, and it is one of 2 providers of legal representation for indigents in the civil arena. And you see, we have in Florida probably one of the greatest public defender systems in the country. Now that I've praised the system, I can also tell you how fraught it is with inequalities. And if you go to our jails, you can see how the laws are exercised by some part of our population and how it is perpetrated on other segments of the population. You look at the jail, and when you are charged with a crime, there is the presumption of innocence. With that presumption comes a presumption of a non-monetary bond. The purpose of a bond is to protect the community and also to guarantee the integrity of the legal system that the person will appear in court. But if you look at who is in jail, there is little thought or consideration as to what your financial resources are. So a $10,000 bond, which is the standard bond for the accusation of burglary, be it a burglary to a car or a garage or a house, how many people can make that? And the reality becomes one of, my clients can't even afford to retain private counsel. They have to rely on my services. So they sit in jail. So are the civil rights of my clients being breached by this exercise of authority? My position is obviously yes. So there is a great disparity in how people are treated and how their civil rights are exercised based upon your economic abilities. I tend to emphasize more on an economic as opposed to racial, gender, ethnic. Either you're poor or you're not poor. That's my reality. The same is true with Legal Aid of Minnesota. You know, at least with the public defender system, if you're charged with a crime, you are by constitutional right entitled to, and you shall be provided legal representation. But in the civil arena, if you're being evicted, if you are being sued, or you want to sue someone because you've been aggrieved, there is no such guarantee. And you see that the doors to the courthouse are dictated by your financial ability and whether you can afford to hire a lawyer, you can afford to pay the filing fees. And so, again, are these individuals' civil rights being violated as a result of their lack of access to justice? My interpretation, again, is absolutely. So it touches in my life every day, and as I see it, but in a different arena. It's not a specific group, but it is our legal and judicial system and our access to it.
One of the things that comes out in the play Thurgood is Thurgood's vision of America. And some of the comments that you hear for people who have seen the play is that it really gives them a sense of patriotism, because it appears from all accounts that Thurgood's goal really was an inclusive society. Those of you who are new to Sarasota or who have moved to Sarasota recently, Sarasota has had some negative publicity. And I guess the question to the panel is whether or not Sarasota is representative of what Thurgood Marshall imagined America would be after all of these laws were passed. For instance, many people who are not from Sarasota, the first comments that they make about Sarasota is the lack of diversity. That they will go downtown, they will go to restaurants, and it appears to be a pretty monolithic crowd, basically whites. White males from the Northeast, the Midwest. Where's the Hispanic population? Where's the African American population? Where's the Asian population? And so the question really becomes whether or not Sarasota is being picked on unnecessarily, or whether or not indeed Sarasota does have a problem that really needs to be addressed as far as its diversity or lack of diversity. So anyone who wants to handle that question, go ahead.
She looks at me. That's all right. Yeah, well, look out at this crowd. You know, we're trying to have a conversation, and it's so hard to get all the different parts of this community together just to have a conversation. And Kate has worked so hard to try to bring the community together. I've been coming down here for 30 years. I'm not from here. You can tell by my accent. I'm sure that I'm from Long Island. Yes, I confess. I confess. My mom has been here for many years, and I remember when first coming down here with my sister and literally getting open-mouthed hard stare downs on the beach in different places because we weren't the usual people that they kind of already know, I guess. I mean, it was real easy back then to peg us. And yet still it's often like that, and is a singular experience in many of these environments. Part of it is that people sort of learn their own safe havens. There's sort of this silo tendency that happens here, and we're really hopeful with this series. I know I am, and I think Kate is as well, that begins that conversation that how do we find out that, certainly as a physician, I've taken care of everybody. I've, statesmen and kings, literally, and the poorest of the poor, and people with swastikas, whatever. I mean, they're human beings. And how do I help get everyone else to that place to know that at the end of the day, if you cut someone open, they all bleed red. It's the same stuff inside. And the same concerns. That's what's fascinating, is people think they're so different. But there's so many similarities. What's different is their experience and their perception of their experience and how they're treated. And we do have to have a conversation, and we have to work harder at that, and we have to work with our young people, because I think they're at a real disservice, because Sarasota is not preparing itself for the future demographic shifts that have already taken place in many places like California or Miami. And just from a business and economic sense, we are really woefully underprepared. You're talking about having this international, rowing venue, et cetera, and we don't really have the kind of cultural and linguistic experience here to deal with. How do you deal with people coming and speaking different languages? How do you deal with different kinds of people and different kinds of religious practices and needs? We have to really prepare and educate ourselves and our young people so they'll be able to go out in the world and interface more efficiently, effectively. Looking at you.
I don't know if this was a prompt from, and I don't mean to be anecdotal in this, but there was a similar question was asked of the panel a couple of years ago that I participated in, and I made the observation that Sarasota might be one of the most segregated communities I've ever been to. And that was substantiated a couple of years back on NPR, where Sarasota, I believe, was ranked 5th as the most segregated communities in the country. And when I say anecdotally, I refer back to when and it's been a number of years, when I was graduating from college, and I was going to come back to Sarasota, and I came with a friend of mine, and he was a doctoral candidate at the University of Florida in the International Relations Department. And he needed a break, and I said, let's go to Sarasota for the summer. We'll get jobs as waiters, and you can hang out and unwind. We can make some money, and you can enjoy the beach, et cetera. And we went to, because I've always worked in restaurants, and I went to restaurant after restaurant after restaurant and shut down. And in my own naivete, I realized, he's black, I'm white, we're going in together. And I look around and I realize there aren't any black waiters in Sarasota. And there hasn't been a tremendous change, a few here and there, but it's still, if you're black, you work in the back. If you're white, then you can serve food. And as soon as we separated as far as job search was concerned, the first place I went to, I got a job. My friend Gary, who, he's getting his PhD, he has his master's degree from Tufts, his undergraduate degree from Mercer, and he would eliminate his educational background so as to not threaten those people he was applying to. And finally he got a job, certainly not as a waiter. And so it was as I said, an awakening for me because of my own naivete, realizing that what Sarasota is, or at least what it was. I can tell you from my own personal experience, both of my children attended Booker Middle School. And it was, I think, a very important experience for my son, especially since he played on the basketball team. And I would go to the games and I would see some friends and they would ask why I'm there, and I'd point out, my son, he's the only Jewish kid on the team. He was also the only white kid on the team. But you saw there was an integration there, and you also, with my son, when he would refer to someone, he never racially identified them. And so there is a cultural change, and I think the cultural change comes through generational. what you're comfortable with, what you're exposed to, and ultimately what becomes the norm. And I think that norm, these changes are unfortunately evolutionary. It doesn't matter what the law might be, as was discussed here, it's the cultural change that takes place. And you can't tell someone to change their culture overnight. It is a growing experience.
Well, I think one of the things that I think of that's an interesting barometer for the LGBT community in Florida is that 17 years ago when Equality Florida formed, people would come to our events in places like Sarasota and St. Petersburg and not want their picture taken because they would be afraid that there'd be proof of them at a gay or lesbian event and they'd be outed and they'd be fired from their job or their family would disown them. And that's certainly not the case just 17 short years later. And I think that's a result of public opinion rapidly shifting over particularly the last 5 to 10 years. And I think for gays and lesbians in Sarasota, they've really seen that reflected in public policy. I mentioned the city of Sarasota has a domestic partner registry. They have a non-discrimination ordinance, which includes the gay and lesbian community. And other smaller communities like Gulfport and Venice, which are local, have passed pro-LGBT policies that affirm the lives of gays and lesbian people. And I think that's just the culmination of the shift in public opinion that's happened in this particular area that has been a really big benefit to the folks who live here in this community.
I think one of the things that I'd like the panel to discuss is the common refrain that we hear, not only as African Americans, but others, in that we have an African American president. We have women who are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. In certain states, gays and lesbians can get married legally. So why are we still harping on this? Why can't we move on to something more? Why can't we all agree that we are all the same, that we are all treated equally under the law? And if we aren't being treated equally under the laws are certainly changing. And there are people who I have asked to come and see the play Thurgood, white males mostly, who say, I don't want to be bashed anymore. I know, I get it. Things were bad. They're improved. I don't hate people because of their race or their sexual orientation. Why should I feel bad about it, sitting in a play about 90 minutes long, where I'm being told how terrible things were by people I never knew about? So I just wondered whether or not we are harping on things that we really shouldn't be harping on, that we should move on. Are these issues that are still with us? Have the plaintiffs, the people who usually bring these suits, have they changed? And anyone who wants to respond to that, because I get that a lot, is that it's over. The war is over. Let's move on. This is causing more division than unification. So that's the question that's being posed. And I'm assuming at some point we'll get some feedback, but I just wondered if anybody ever had that posed to them, that we should get over all of this.
Yeah, I get to go first again, Larry. Okay, thanks, Larry. Well, the first thing that came to mind for me as you were saying that, which, when people start with that, I sort of glaze over like, yeah, but we still have so far to go. There's symbolism and there's realities. If you just look at, they repeated the psychological tests that they did on Brown versus the Board of Education. And if you look at young people, even today, I'm sure if you did it again, it was recently, they repeated the tests. And the children, all the children, both the European American and the African American children, all picked the white doll as the beautiful doll, as the smart doll, as the nice doll, as the kind of representative of the kid they want to have friends. If you look at the imagery that's happening in the media, and you look at the Europeanization around the world, you have women in Asia trying to open up their eyes. You have all of these body image things taking place now because of the power of the internet to sort of foster a certain ideal that still is very melanin negative, if I could say that. It's very melanin negative, and I just came up with that.
Melanin challenged.
Yeah, challenged. You can coin that. I think about Charlene Hunter Galt and, her incredible journey, and she spoke yesterday. It was fabulous. And I, like her, have had a lot of experience in South Africa, which is an amazingly moving story. We're not all there yet, but the fact that they had a process of truth and reconciliation Okay, that they were willing to say, okay, let's have a real conversation. Let's have public confession and forgiveness. I mean, it doesn't change what happened. It doesn't make it stop. It doesn't make people forget. But it's like, let's just admit some really horrible things happened here. You know, my daughter right now is learning about the Holocaust. We do a very good job about that recent history and trying to at least educate the kids. They can't really quite process what that was, but it's at least in our recent history of what that was. And we have media imagery to show. You know, we really don't have that kind of history being told about what was really done to the indigenous people when the Europeans came, what was really being done to the Africans. I mean, this whole thing of going up to St. Augustine, the oldest city, I had a huge disagreement with one of my daughter's schools because they thought it was so great to go to St. Augustine. I was like, you know, I go to St. Augustine, it's a painful experience for me. You know, they've changed the way they give the tours. To, you know, these were the servants. Or slavery wasn't so bad under the Spaniards. There's like a market square that they talk about. It was the market, but it was like that was an auction block. Don't change this history. If you're going to take these kids, don't sanitize it then. So the fact that we're not really telling the story and
It's shocking, Lisa.
it's the realities. And it's not like making current day people feel guilty about anyone's ancestors. It's like, look, this is what happened. What do we do to say this happened, this was wrong, and what are we going to all take responsibility for to make sure we're not doing it again? And, you know, look at Syria, look at Rwanda. I mean, how many times are we going to repeat these patterns in human life and existence? And with that,
Can I just add in before you speak on that, and this is a question too for you, Judge. I think what I want to add in just what you're saying is that in Germany, what they did after World War II was quite commendable, how they've worked with their public in reconciliation as well. I find it quite shocking that we have never had a national apology for slavery. Personally, I find that shocking. It goes a long way in many countries when the Vatican apologizes for their commiseration in World War II. Do you feel it would be helpful to have a national apology?
and reparations.
That's pretty clear. Judge, how do you feel?
Well, you would ask that question.
Yes, Judge.
I'm throwing this at him.
One of the problems with reparations is one of the really unique issues about race in America, and that is actually who is black. One of the cases that's discussed in the play, Plessy versus Ferguson, is one of the most fascinating cases, not necessarily because of the separate but equal doctrine that fostered the Plessy decision. And if you don't know about it, Plessy versus Ferguson was the separate but equal case in which an African American was told to leave a streetcar in New Orleans. The interesting thing about the Plessy case is that Homer Plessy, for all practical purposes, was a white man. He was 1/8 African. And in New Orleans, as you know, they have quadroons and octoroons, but quite frankly, no one really knew that Homer Plessy was even black. The actual streetcar company pushed Homer Plessy to do this because they didn't want to pay for extra streetcars just for African Americans. So that case was pushed through the court system really on money from the streetcar company in New Orleans. So when we talk about reparations now, the question is, well, who's black? For the most part, as you can see, the color of America is changing. Who actually qualifies? I mean, geneticists and biologists will tell you that race really is meaningless. It means nothing. You know, these characteristics that we have are just characteristics. So the problem with reparations, I think, at this point is, quite frankly, there are people in this audience, quite frankly, right now, maybe they know it, maybe they don't, but they have African blood in them. And if you believe all of the reports, everyone has African blood in them because that's where the first man came from, was African. So you have all sorts of scientific and genetic issues if you wanted to do reparations. Quite frankly, I think the most important thing is reconciliation. And one of the hardest parts about reconciliation is coming to grips with what happened. There's a great movie out called 12 Years a Slave, which many people are reluctant to see. I encourage you to see it if you haven't. But the hard part of seeing it isn't because of what occurred, but because we know this occurred, and we actually have to come to grips with it. And so South Africa would not be South Africa if people did not come to grips with what occurred. And I don't think America would be America if people have not come to grips with what occurred. So the idea, going back to your original question, I think reconciliation is more important than reparations at this point, at least in my opinion.
So move to Larry.
I look to Chile and I look to Argentina, where they did have the Truth and Reconciliation boards or panels, which were very effective in the healing process after the Pinochet regime. And again, I turn it towards myself, and I guess I look to how I have approached it in my life, not only in my life's work, but also, which is my profession, but also my life's work, which would be my children. And it is the concept of a sense of entitlement and trying to explain to them what they are entitled to. And as a Jew, what am I entitled to? And the people I represent who have been, if they're, as I said, not predominantly, they're all poor. And what are they entitled to because they're poor? Or because they're black, what are they entitled to? And it comes down to, as a humanist, I think that everyone is entitled to the same thing, to be treated with dignity and respect. There has to be an acknowledgement of the past, but that cannot be, from my perspective, the basis upon which you go forward. I get into these arguments, especially when I discuss the Palestinian-Israeli issue, and I want to say, I don't care what happened even yesterday. The conversation has to start now, and we have to go forward. I want the violence to stop, and I want people to start treating each other like human beings. That's the way I was raised in my household. And it's not because someone should be treated differently because I'm a Jew and I should be treated differently because of what occurred in the Holocaust, or because you're black and what happened in slavery. There has to be an acknowledgement. There has to be a realistic and an unadulterated history so that we know what happened. But from that point forward, that's when I say enough. You can't go with reparations. I think that goes because then you start balancing who's owed more, who's entitled to more. And then there's that, as I said, there's that word again, entitlement. And that's where I think you get into differences, and that's where you get into arguments, and that's where you get into wars.
I know at some point we're going to open it up to questions, but I want to sort of direct this to Michael. One of the truths about this country is that the Constitution, whether or not people were intended to be included in the original writing of it, is one of the most beautiful instruments ever written. The Bill of Rights, the whole issue of due process and equal protection, all of the language that came out of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is so beautiful. My concern is that there are people who are still fighting for their rights under the Constitution, that for whatever reason, and I'll use the gay and lesbian community, many people don't feel should have those same battles fought for them. It's the battles that were fought for African American rights. And I wondered how Equality Florida feels about that, whether or not you feel that enough has been done with the civil rights movement to encompass the initiatives that you're involved with, and whether or not the gay and lesbian community, the transgender community, feels left behind, that they feel left out over the rights that we have fought so hard to get.
Obviously I can't speak for the entire LGBT community, but I'll do my best. And I think people feel really grateful for, particularly in the last few years, the way that leaders from the civil rights movement have stepped up to sort of to bless this movement and sort of look at it as a natural extension of the work that was done. The NAACP came out in support of marriage equality. And that was a huge, huge moment for lots of gay and lesbian people, particularly gay and lesbian people of color, to have that acknowledgement. And, I think that that's gone a long way to helping folks feel like there's a lot of support there.
The last question, and I wanted to get this in because one of the things about Thurgood Marshall was that he was a criminal lawyer. And a lot of the precedent cases that dealt with due process as it applied to those accused of crimes, including the Supreme Court coming down and saying that you can't coerce confessions, came out of a 1940 case out of Florida that Thurgood Marshall argued in front of the Supreme Court. Most people think that there's too much protection for the criminally accused. And so, as a Sarasota public defender, can you assure this audience that if they are unfortunately ever accused of a crime, they don't have to worry about things like coerced confessions, illegal searches? That has been taken care of, and the laws protect all of us.
I think the audience has answered the question for me. Because when I was in law school some time ago, and it was interesting because when I took criminal procedure and constitutional law, when we came to the Fourth Amendment, which is the protection of illegal search and seizure, my professor, who I adored, this man was just one of the most outstanding speakers and had argued before the United States Supreme Court more than a dozen times. And he introduces the class by saying that this is a class in legal history. So it is, again, what Charles was saying earlier about our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, I would honestly say that I'm a recent student of American history, and I became in love with reading stories about Benjamin Franklin, about John Adams, about the Founding Fathers. When you look at and Joseph Ellis's book is actually the book that started me on this road. You had, in a moment in history, maybe the greatest collections of intellects doing a social experiment, which we are still participating in to this day. I mean, this is not a done deal. Again, everything to me is evolutionary. But it started the process, and I don't think you realize how extraordinary this experiment is until you compare it to where we were in history and comparing it to other societies. And so, getting back to the question of the rights that are guaranteed with it, it's a constant ebb and flow. It's a constant battle. The case that Charles was describing said that a coerced confession, by its very nature, shocks the conscience of the court, and therefore we will not permit its admission in a trial. It has no place in a trial. Well, some years passed, and the composition of the Supreme Court has changed, and now they've said, well, we'll let it in, but we'll let you argue that it was coerced. So there is that constant, the battle lines are always changing and redrawn, and so the fight never ends. So yes, right now you can beat the hell out of somebody, and that confession can be entered, but as a defense attorney, I get to argue, yes, but how did you get that confession? And I don't know how many people have read the blogs, and I don't mean to belabor a single point, but I had the pleasure of meeting a gentleman by the name of Walter Ruiz, who's a commander in the Navy, and he's in the JAG Corps, and his assignment through the JAG Corps is representing Guantanamo detainees. And to hear his story, and again, they're not American citizens, so they're not guaranteed the same privileges. It's not on American soil, even though it's in Guantanamo, because if they were brought here, it's not security that keeps them from bringing the Guantanamo detainees here. It's the laws of the United States would then apply. And so for 10 months, he represented someone. And for 10 months, he was denied an interpreter. He is a commander in the Navy. He's assigned by the Justice Department to represent him, but you can't have an interpreter. Also, when you walk in, he has to walk in with a blank tablet of paper. He can spend all day with his client. He can fill that tablet with the information that he's gotten from his client, and then when he leaves that room, he has to hand that document over to the government for their review to inspect whether or not it in any way encroaches on national security. And again, he's not an American citizen, but where I go back to my position that as a human being, we're the United States. I hold us to a very high standard. And I want the same rights that everyone here enjoys. We should express that across the world. We should be that shining beacon. And the criminal justice system does allow that. And believe me, there are a lot of defeats, mainly defeats, but we have inroads. And we see that there's an evolution that is positive. And I truly believe very shortly that Florida will adopt the notion that permits gay marriage, because to me that's nothing more than a contract, and that's a breach of the Constitution that you're not allowing somebody to enter into a contract. So I'm throwing that in on the side to show my solidarity with the...
I wanted to...
Before we go to a few questions, and I do want to get some of your questions in, I do want to, the judge, and he doesn't know I'm going to ask him this, just to paint one picture for us of a group that's not here and bring it close to home, and that's the Hispanic group in our culture. And if you can share with our audience, there was a moment, an experience that I have heard you speak about, and that was the amnesty moment where people came in Palmetto.
Well,
and I think it's a wonderful picture for us to leave about civil rights and a group close to us.
well, once a year, the Mexican consulate actually sets up shop in Palmetto in order to give its Mexican nationals who have entered this country illegally documentation that they can use. And it's as though the entire nation of Mexico is in a 20 by 20 square room in Palmetto. Because one of the problems with people who come into this country illegally is they can't get identification, they can't open bank accounts, they have to carry cash with them, they're victims of robberies, and one of the reasons is because they can't prove who they are. So one day I happened to be near this area and I see this line that goes all the way, it must be a mile long, and inside the building is technically Mexico. And there's someone, they bring their papers that they brought from Mexico to show that they are Mexican nationals, and they get an identification. And this allows them a basic right to put the money that they earn in a bank account, because banks won't allow them to open an account without that type of identification. And that did affect me, because, you know, whether or not they're legal or illegal, they are paying taxes, they're buying goods, they're buying services.
Their children are here.
But they have to line up for hours on end just to get a basic document to show who they are as a person.
And that's once a year.
That's once a year. Once a year.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to questions. I'm going to repeat the questions, so I'm going to ask you to stand, give us a succinct question rather than comments, and then I will repeat it for the whole audience, and we'll let our panel respond. The gentleman right up here on the aisle. Great question. Do medical schools in Florida have affirmative action programs?
Well, you know, since the Bakke decision, there is no need for affirmative action because we'd be otherwise committing reverse discrimination. When I was in the state of California, they had to really do some fancy double clutching, because if they didn't find other ways to try to assess people and to weight their entry point, the University of California at Berkeley, for example, would be 100% Asian if it was based solely on grade point. And they have seen a significant drop in the number of all different types of groups getting into their university systems. We have a real problem nationally in terms of all physicians. African Americans are only 2.5% of all physicians. That number has remained unchanged for about 100 years, and 2/3 of all those physicians have been produced by Howard University, Meharry University, and more recently Morehouse and Charles Drew University, which are historically black universities. Although they do educate a lot of Jewish people when they couldn't go to majority universities and the like. So we, certainly my organization, the National Medical Association, have led a concerted effort to build what we call the Health Leadership Pipeline, because we understand the need. Certainly one of the solutions represented through the Institute of Medicine report was more culturally competent and culturally representative care providers, because we know that physicians of color, be it African American, Hispanic, even Asian, tend to go back to their communities or are sought out from members of their communities because of the cultural similarities and the greater levels of comfort. So we have been actively working to recruit and train and retain, but that goes then to the next issue, and you talk about another civil right we didn't really discuss, and that's about the whole achievement gap. When you have separate systems of education under the supposed domain of public education, and you have kids in one school that doesn't have books, computers, leaking roofs, not even proper heat and air conditioning, et cetera, and you have kids at other schools that have all of those amenities and then some, obviously there is not a level playing field in terms of when they're going to meet their standardized tests. And so one of my issues in coming to Florida, having lived and worked in many other places, is my dismay at how ill-prepared all of the students are to some extent, and certainly many of the students coming from lower income and communities of color, where there aren't that many generations ahead of them of people with any experience in preparing for that. So we have to go back all the way. The pipeline, we're starting in elementary and middle school. That's where we work at to get kids through little by little, and the numbers are still woefully inadequate. And we welcome any support and help on that, because these kids need mentoring, they need encouragement. Many of them are often the first high school, much less college graduates, much less any type of graduate level graduate.
To understand that, even to amplify that, Lisa, our state has a reward system financially for schools. So if you do well on the tests, you get lots of money. Well, that really works well. If you come from an affluent neighborhood that has a lot of support, and they go to a great school, they've got a great PTA, they've got lots of funding, and they get all A's. Well, what if the school is poor? What if it's a lot of single families working? And the school, and they're not eating breakfast, or they're eating breakfast and lunch at the school, and their grades are not that great. That school that needs that extra support, that needs that mentoring, not just volunteering, but our culture to support it financially, it gets pulled from the school. So we've had schools that are poor being pulled vice principals, extra teachers, library aides, all of those extra things that make the affluent school affluent. We rob the children. And based on a grade, and we know that grades do not make success, emotional intelligence makes success. So we're actually telling the person, like the dolls, you're not good, because anybody can be poor and be helped and do great. We have a lot of success stories of scholarships, but we're robbing them, and we're telling them, you're the bad doll, culturally. Another question. This gentleman right here on the side there. Thank you. Will you repeat the question?
I'll let you repeat the question. I was going to answer the question. Go ahead and repeat the question.
I want to make sure we get it there. The financial disparity in our country, what we call the haves and the have-nots, and we've developed this kind of lingo about it, is actually a very serious problem with the growing gap between rich and poor.
I think the biggest example of that is the reputation. Again, those of you who have been in Sarasota for a short period of time may not know this. At one point, Sarasota was voted the meanest city in America. And one of the reasons it was voted the meanest city in America was how it treated the homeless population, which is probably the biggest example of class disparity. That has not only had an impact in terms of the image of Sarasota, but it's had an impact in terms of the court system. And I'd like Larry to talk a little bit about that, because at some point you have to question whether or not we are actually criminalizing status. And how the homeless are treated is an issue. a major issue here in Sarasota, and I just wondered if Larry had a comment on that.
I thought I mentioned that before. Maybe I wasn't making myself clear, but yes, to me, the issues are predominantly economic. And whether it be within the justice system, whether it be in the medical system, whether it be in our educational system, you know, and I don't, how far do I go and how much do I not want to get reelected? You know, to me, using the example of education, and I don't want to go, I mean, the legal system is just so blatantly the inequities there based upon economic status. And I get into these discussions, I mean, something as simple as a stop by a law enforcement officer, and you have what is called and what is deemed to be constitutionally acceptable, a consensual encounter. Which means if I were a police officer, I have the same rights as any other citizen to approach Kate and have a conversation with her. Now, of course, when I'm wearing full tactical gear and having this conversation, it's somewhat intimidating. There's the word I'm looking for. The next question that I can ask as a law enforcement officer, which happens frequently, is, do you mind if I search you for any weapons or contraband? Meaning that I don't have any evidence whatsoever to search you, but I can ask you that because any normal citizen can come up to you and ask that. And what I find in a repeat scenario is my clients allegedly saying, sure, they conduct this search and oh my God, drugs are found on him. And oh my God, at this point, after being so cooperative and so cordial and congenial, that's the point where my client decides to run or fight with the officer. So not only does he have the possession of narcotics, he has the resisting with violence and battery on a law enforcement officer. Now, I ask the question, when was the last time my mother was ever approached by a law enforcement officer and asked, by the way, can I search you? So the fallacies that we've created, and this is the frustration that I deal with on a day-to-day basis, is that racial? Yes, because there's the joke within the legal community is DWB, which is driving while black. But it's the same is true with Hispanic, and believe me, if you drive a piece of, this is being taped so I can't use profanity, car, that's another basis for being stopped. Because you're not going to get stopped if you're in a brand new Mercedes-Benz. It's unless you're black. I stand corrected. Although there's a less likelihood of it. There is a whitening effect, you could say. So yes, there's no question. And I say time and time again, access to the civil arena as well is absolutely dictated by. In all my years, I never had a civil suit in being involved with it. It was the rudest awakening I've ever had as to how it was done. The delay tactics, it's a war of attrition that can only be fought by people of wealth because who else can afford legal representation that goes on forever?
Last question. Yes, this gentleman right on the aisle there. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with custom and human nature? We started that early. Statistics aside, we can change laws, but how do we change people?
I'm going to answer that very quickly. Because of my limited expertise, I can't say much about it. But my undergraduate study was cultural anthropology. And the notion of human nature is its adaptation to its environment. And human nature, as you're trying to describe it, I think, is there is no common thread that goes across every society at all time. That's human nature. Human nature is breathing, it's procreation, it's the necessity to survive. But how we treat one another, that's taught. That is, and so culturally, you're correct. And that's where I say it changes over time. It is a process of evolution. And I think that one of the best examples I can give, especially dealing with the gay community, would be the military. And you see the evolutionary change that has taken place where being gay was meant that you had to hide it because if you were gay and in the military, you were out. That evolves to a Don't ask, don't tell, which was this progressive notion by the Clinton administration, and that was accepted for a time period. And then from there, it was recognized that's wrong and that's bad. And we've evolved now to a policy of the acceptance of gays in the military, and that's not a basis. I'm not saying that there isn't prejudice within the military towards gays, but it can't be used as the sole basis to being drummed out, or a criminal act, because if I'm not mistaken, you could be court-martialed if it was that you were gay. But I'm not in the military, so I'm speaking out of turn there.
Well, I'll just, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead after that. I mean, I think for the gay and lesbian community, one of the biggest things that has been a benefit to our movement has been the ability for people to feel safe to come out, and for them to feel that they can share their stories with their friends and family. And I think when you talk about changing customs and the way that people relate to gays and lesbians, when folks see their stories, when folks see loving, committed gay couples and families with children on TV, and when they know their neighbor down the street is a gay person, and they're not having their partner go out the back door in the morning to work, it changes people's perceptions, and they realize that we're quite a lot like everyone else. And so I think that's one of the biggest contributing factors to the change in philosophy about gays and lesbians.
I think that it gets personal. What I love the best is when I see these grandparents dragging along with these little wild, nappy-headed children. They're trying to figure out how did that happen, but they love them, right? You know, the same thing with more acceptance of the LGBT community. I mean, they've been in everyone's family, always. Now it's a little more acceptable, and then once people start realizing, you know, or the nice guys next door, or those nice ladies up the street, they're people. Once it gets personal, and people have that personal experience, or it's in your family, or it's your children, or your sister, or your mother, or whatever, that's also what is a compelling force for change, because then people can't really escape that reality that they're living with that person, and they're living their pain, too. And then that's part of why everyone wants to make that change. And that's my hope, and that's my excitement for the future, because we're all one people. And it's really kind of funny when you think about these divisions that we create for ourselves, that they really are artificial. I think you brought up a great point. I mean, from a genetic standpoint, we probably have more in common with chimpanzees, you know, than worrying about this issue. I mean, they have this new thing now where you can look at your genetic thing and have it and analyze on where you're from. And I had a recent interesting experience with a family member who's came out, you know, it was like 60% African, you know, a lot of it from Ethiopia, whatever, but 30% of it was Ashkenazi. You know, Jamaica has got a real huge thing with all of the different intermingling, when you think of all the people who came there to discover it, and, you know, the Spanish and the Jewish and all of this stuff. And so that they're generations ahead of where the rest of the world is going to be, because it all has come together, and now everybody's everything, and that's their motto: out of many, one people. And that's supposedly on our money, but, you know, we got to live up to it. We're getting there.
Judge, do you want to weigh in on that?
The only thing that I want to say, I have a lot of cause for optimism, and the argument is that you can't change people's hearts and minds. That was the argument that actually segregationists used in the 50s and 60s to say that, ho, 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 this Brown v. Board, we need to wait and let people decide on their own. Well, we probably would have waited another 50 years had that occurred. So there's pros and cons to that statement. But I don't want to leave here, and I don't want those who have come here to feel that Sarasota is not a great community. And I just want to acknowledge a few things before we leave here, that Sarasota really is a diverse community. The problem is that people don't get together to celebrate that diversity. I certainly want to thank Kate Alexander and Florida Studio Theater for bringing a play like Thurgood, which has allowed us to celebrate the differences in Sarasota. One of the things that we are doing with this play is bringing in high school students to see it, because one of the problems is that high school students and younger people have no idea. They think that segregation was something that occurred with the Romans and the Greeks, and it was thousands of years ago, and they have no idea how recent it was. So we are optimistic by showing this play to them that they know that there's still a lot of work to be done. And the central theme that I wanted to bring out is that we still have a lot of work to do, but I'm very optimistic. And I'll leave you with this. What gave me the most optimism that we were going in the right direction as a country was a few years ago, I happened to be in Mississippi, and I was driving through Mississippi, and there's this billboard, and on it was an African-American woman welcoming you to Oxford, Mississippi. She was the National Alumni President for the University of Mississippi, an African-American woman. And I said, it doesn't get much better than that. So I have a lot of cause for optimism, and I think that these types of forums are very important. The only thing I'd like to do is ask the three panelists. I know one is not from Sarasota, but I'd like Larry and Lisa to at least express to this audience what you find optimistic about being in Sarasota, and why you feel that this community, hopefully you feel that this community is on the right track.
All I can say, this is my home. And so, there's always cause for optimism. I think, but I don't want to be a cynic. I like to be considered a skeptic. But I see it all around us. I see it in this room right here. As long as there's a conversation, things are going to get better. That's all I can say. I see Pastor Tom in the audience there, and I've been working with the homeless shelter. I've never seen this community come together as it has in addressing the homeless issue, as it has with bringing Robert Marbut here, and the promise that that poses to this community. So I see it every day. I see it in my children, and I see it. So maybe I'm being naive, maybe I just choose it. I fight the battle every day because you can't sit on your laurels, but this is a great community, and I've been here since, I'm a relative newcomer. I've been here since 1968. So it's, I'm going to fight to make it even better.
Yeah, I just say hope springs eternal. Really and truly, Larry. And, like you, I've seen this place grow and change and evolve. And there is a lot of love and good intention in this community. It's an amazing philanthropic community. I think if there would be more opening of the minds to understand that there are other things that are also important, and they need support, and they need encouragement, and they need investment, and an active role of inclusivity, particularly in the leadership arena, particularly in the nonprofit arena, have greater diversity of all types, and really involve, invite, and listen to what people have to say. And on a personal level, make an effort to get to know somebody a little different, or from not from your world, or even your next door neighbor behind the garage door opener. I mean, it's a little strange here how people do that thing. But I think the young people also give me a lot of hope. My daughter too. I mean, they are the future, and they see the world very differently than we do. They interact on whole different levels, in terms of what's important, how fast can you text? I mean, I don't know. It's a whole different thing. And so I think there is hope, and we always have to hold on to that, and we have to foster and build that. And I thank Kate, and I think things like this, and the more we look at this and the interest that lies in doing things like this, the more it's going to happen.
And I didn't want to leave Michael out. Although Michael's not a resident of Sarasota, I would like to ask him what gives him optimism about Florida in terms of what he's seen and observed.
I just wish I lived in Sarasota. So, maybe one day. So Equality Florida, our role in the state is really as an advocate, and we do a lot of lobbying in the state capitol. And I think your local state senator, Nancy Dietert, is actually, she's an example for me of the way that things are changing on LGBT issues. We have a really hard time with the Republican caucus in Tallahassee. For years and years and years, they didn't give us meetings. They would kick us out of their offices if we were able to get a meeting. But Nancy Dietert is an example of someone who has moved on these issues. In the last legislative session, she voted for our statewide domestic partner registry bill, and she was the deciding vote to pass that bill out of that committee. And it was the first time in Florida history that an LGBT rights bill had passed in the Florida, or out of a committee in the Florida Senate. So that gives me hope. And I hope that we continue to see other folks step up like that and be brave and show leadership on these kinds of issues.
I want to thank our panel. Each one of these people is working on the front lines on civil rights in our city and in our state. And it changes things. You make a difference every day, every one of you. So I would like to thank them very much for coming. I also want to thank them because I think it's important to be brave and look at the shadow and the light. You know, we can stay positive or we can go into the negative, but we have to look at both to come out with any kind of wisdom, and all of you are fearless about doing that, and that's why we have these panels. There are 3 more to go. We hope that you join us for those. They're getting sold out, and we appreciate your coming. The panel will be here for a few more minutes, and I'd like to leave you with the oath of Langford Wilson. If you saw the play, he ends with, you know, America was never America to me, but I swear this oath, America will be. Every one of us, like Larry said, is involved in that active verb, it will be. And it's an oath, he says, so I think we're all responsible to continue it. Thank you. We'll see you at the theater.